The 2023 Japanese Grand Prix gave us an interesting situation with Sergio Perez. For the second week in a row, Checo mistook a Formula One Grand Prix for a demolition derby and retired on lap 15 after sustaining too much damage and going through most of the spare wings stacked up on his side of the garage. And we would have all been forgiven for assuming that was that. Do not pass go, do not collect points, retreat to driver's room, and await inevitable uncomfortable debrief. But then, a few laps later, there was a bizarre sight that harkened back to the days of spare cars. Sergio Perez was getting back in the cockpit. He'd go on to complete 2 more laps after serving a 5-second time penalty in the pits, all to avoid a grid drop for the next race in Qatar. And while this is technically within the current sporting regulations, it sure does leave a bit of a sour taste, even if it made for some extra interest in what was overall a pretty average Grand Prix once all the first lap shenanigans had shaken out. Now, I hate to shine a spotlight on Checo for this. I actually kinda like the guy. I was rooting for him earlier in the season when it looked like he maybe might be able to mount a bit of a challenge to the max. But that's 2 races in a row now where Checo has decided that both appropriate application of the brakes and peripheral vision are overrated. Last week, after a prang that forced Alex Albon back a few places and out of the points, he took off into the distance and suffered 0 consequences. This week, after a retirement due to his own crash-happy shenanigans, rinse and repeat. Weird as hell double retirement, but fundamentally, no repercussions. So the question then, should penalties for collisions be adjusted? And if so, what should the current system be replaced with? At the moment, the stewards have the option of 4 different penalties for a driver who's deemed responsible for an incident. First, a 5 or a 10-second time penalty that needs to be served either at the end of the race or during a pit stop. Second, a drive-through penalty, where the car needs to drive through the pits before rejoining and does not necessarily have to stop. And finally, a 10-second stop-go penalty, where a driver needs to complete a 10-second stop in their pit box during the race. None of these can be served under a VSC or a safety car, and in the case of the stop-go and the drive-through penalties, must effectively be served within 2 laps. At the moment, the penalty du jour seems to be 5 seconds. For the likes of Carlos Sainz in Melbourne, this had some pretty dramatic consequences that took him all the way from 5th down to 12th, thanks to the whole thing ending under a safety car, following what I still think was a ludicrous call from race control to do a standing restart so late in the Grand Prix. For Checo, 2 weeks in a row, that same penalty has had effectively no effect. His results would have been the same whether he were penalised or not. And of course these sort of penalties often come with licence points, but the last time we saw somebody hit the magic number of 12 and get a suspension was back in never. So what's the alternative though? And should the punishment fit the crime? Should an incident where the wrong driver was forced to retire carry far harsher repercussions than one where it took them a lap longer to make up a position? Well, no, I don't think it should go that far. Mostly because it's pretty common for a relatively innocuous looking incident to result in terminal damage, but something needs to be done to discourage drivers with a significant equipment advantage from taking gaps that were never there. Sure, crashes can be kind of exciting to watch, and they give us something to talk about in the aftermath, but at the same time, it sucks to be these guys. The way I see it, there's a few options. First, every instance where the stewards find a driver at fault, it's a 10-second stop-go. Keep the current rule of this needing to be taken before the driver crosses the start-finish line for a 3rd time following the ruling. If it happens in the last 3 laps of the race, then the average time taken during the race for any driver to do a pit stop, minus the actual stationary time, plus 10 seconds, that would be applied at the conclusion. And that sounds really complicated, but it's actually quite simple. Basically, if the average time for a pit stop is 20 seconds and the average time stationary is 2.5, that gives you 17.5 seconds to add 10 seconds to, which results in a total of 27.5 seconds time penalty. Now that sounds like a lot, but if you're somebody who's cruising 15, 17 seconds ahead of the car behind, that's only going to be 1, 2, maybe 3 places depending on how much the pack's bunched up. The second is an automatic grid drop for the next race. I'm thinking 5 slots? At the end of the day, there's a lot of opportunity to make up places during the start of a race, and 3 slots isn't exactly that much of a deterrent if you're Max Verstappen and, God forbid, have to start in 4th rather than on pole. It's also a harsher penalty than the current apparently not so standard 3-place grid penalty for impeding in qualifying, which is arguably not as severe an offence as just yeeting yourself into another car. Honestly, these last 2 races, the FIA has a lot of work to do with the red pen, I think. There's going to be some clarifications. The issue with this option is that it carries no consequences for the actual race when the offence occurs. Maybe it could be used in conjunction with a time penalty, but this doesn't resolve the issue with the wild variation in consequences for individual drivers depending on specific race circumstances. So then we go on to my next galaxy-brained idea. If the driver who was hit is still running, the one who did the damage has to drop back behind them, regardless of the position of the wronged party, and regardless of how long it takes the stewards to make the call. You're in 1st and now they're in 10th? Oh no. Took the stewards 10 minutes to make the call and now that car is a lap behind? Park it up. If it resulted in a retirement, then you're dead last. This is the chaos option. I hate it, but I also kind of love it. Could you imagine the absolute pandemonium? Immaculate. Moves my furniture in kind of a messed up way. And finally, my personal favourite. You hit someone, you get a 3-place penalty. That's it. Regardless of where you finish, or how far ahead you are, or what the consequences were on the other driver, and then if you DNF, then it's the same number of places on the next starting grid. Because while retirement might seem punishment enough, at the end of the day, mate, you made that bed, now you gotta lie in it. To take the Sainz and Perez examples, this would have meant Carlos still saw consequences, but not 7 places, and Checo wouldn't have effectively got off scot-free beyond a bit of internal cringe. So what are your thoughts? Does the current system work, or does it need to be chucked in the bin with all the wings that Checo went through this weekend? Pop an idea down in the comments if you have something to say, and if you're so inclined, maybe give the like and subscribe buttons a little tippy tap. Every time you interact with one of my videos, Liam Lawson's chances of getting a seat next year improve by a fraction of percent, asterisk. And to bring it back to Checo, I don't know fellas, but I think we're looking at a 50-50 chance of a mid-winter break contract buyout.